What else do I want to say? Crime is not the cause of this new prison structure. Here is the violent crime rate trend over the last quarter of the 20th century. As you can see, it showed no particular tendency to rise from 1973 to 1993, and then in the early 1990s, it began to decline precipitously. I grant you, violent crime had been rising in the years prior to 1973. Yes?
Don't people use that as a justification for why, meaning that the system has worked?
Yeah, there's the causal question, though. I mean, people will say, oh, great, exactly. We locked up a lot of people and crime rates went down. And then we have to get into the causal question of whether or not the decline in crime rates is accounted for by the increase in incarceration. To which the answer is no. The estimates vary, but even the most generous estimates of the fraction of the reduction in crime that can be accounted for by, and what would be the mechanisms? Well, one mechanism would be by locking up people who are repeat offenders, you incapacitate them while they are locked up from being able to commit offenses. So maybe by putting so many people in prison, we've taken the offending people off the streets, and that's why the crime rate is going down. And another mechanism might be by locking up so many people, you send a signal so that others who are thinking about offending but can see how many are in prison don't want that fate for themselves, and so elect not to do the thing that would have been a crime. And that is another mechanism through which incarceration might reduce crime. But what I'm just going to assert to you, I can't prove it here, but the research is there. I would direct you to my webpage, for example, my course on punishment that you can reach through my webpage has a lot of data and links to studies and things of this kind, is that at most 1/4, and there are arguments about that, of the reduction in offending that you're seeing, this is violent crime. I can show you a similar picture for what they call index crimes, which includes major property crimes along with the violent crimes like robbery and assault. The open circles are the crime rate, the closed circles is the incarceration rate. It's basically showing you the story there. As I said, crime had been rising prior to the late 1970s and the early 1980s, but it definitely falls off after the 1990s. So I guess my answer to you is yes, some part of the reduction in crime is associated with increased incarceration, but not most of it. But what was I saying? I was saying it's a big deal. I was saying we're spending a lot of money. Drugs. SSDP. So let's talk about drugs. Okay. So Justice Policy Institute does a very interesting study looking at thousands of counties across the United States to look at the variation among those counties in how many people are going to jail. And it turns out the blacker the county, the more people who are being arrested for drug offenses, although that's a fairly simplistic way of looking at it. But the main point that I want to emphasize with this study is that everybody is breaking the drug laws in this country, but not everybody is going to jail for doing that. Now, as I look around the room, it's very clear that no one here gets high. Okay? That's very clear. But somehow, when they do the survey of the American population, they're estimating a 19.5 million size drug-using population. Okay? These are illegal substances like, let's see, marijuana, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, ecstasy, stuff like that. These are self-reports. They may be underestimates. The survey taker goes and he asks people, did you use this illegal substance anytime in the last 30 days, last 90 days, last year? People say yes or no. Okay, so if they tell the truth, you get an accurate estimate. But of the 19.5 million users, there are 1.5 million drug arrests every year. And of the 1.5 million drug arrests, there are 175,000 admissions to prison every year. So there's a winnowing. Now, not unlike the prohibition of alcohol, when you make a law that everybody is going to break, you just gave the gendarmes a great deal of power. Okay? Because they get to decide who to arrest. So, sociologists at the University of Washington get in police cars in Seattle and ride around and do careful observational study of how the police are enforcing drug laws in the city of Seattle in the late 1990s. What they find is that there are open-air drug markets all over the city. I mean, these are basically places where you can sort of drive up and there's somebody standing on the corner or back in the hallway or something like that, and you kind of, the first glance, the look or whatever, the money passes hands, the drugs get in, the people take off. Okay? That's as distinct from you kind of beep for somebody or whatever, you text them, you know, and they, you know, you kind of go into the dorm room. Again, I know it doesn't happen at Brown, but in other places, those transactions would not be in the streets. The police would have a hard time penetrating those networks and arresting those people unless there was some insider who was, you know, undercover operation or whatever. But these open-air markets are all over Seattle, okay? It turns out that the cops are like a magnet on the open-air markets that are around where the black people are hanging out in that part of town, and the cops are really not very much paying attention to the open-air market elsewhere. Now, the researchers say it's not like they're explicitly racist and they just get in the car and they say, let's go find some, you know, black people to lock up, knowing that we could have also gone to find white people. It's that their conception of a bad part of town in need of policing is hooked up with racial ideas, perhaps implicitly, perhaps not even to their own conscious awareness. Okay? But the consequence of that is you're much more likely to get caught and locked up if you were living in Seattle in that year, breaking the drug laws, if you were black. So anyway, there's a funnel here, and you see the idea. A lot of people break the law, a few people go to jail for it, and the police get to decide who those people are going to be. Okay? Our drug laws are off the hook, man. They are unmatched by anything that anybody else is doing. I mean, look at this graphic. Look at this. Look at this. In 2003, there were 500,000 Americans in prison for drug offenses, 500,000 of them. In Europe, which has a 50% bigger population than the United States, that's 483 million compared to 282 million. Okay? There were 1/10 as many people in prison for drug offenses. Okay? With 2/3 of the population, we imprison 10 times as many people for drug offenses. I don't know about you. That staggers me. That's an interesting phenomenon. This is something that happened in real historical time. Beginning in the 1980s, we declared war on drugs. You may not be able to read this graphic. I'll just tell you. That top line that's going up very rapidly is an index of 100 in 1980. Okay, so that's 100. So everything is relative to that. So if that line is up at 1,000, that means 10 times as many. If it's up at 1,200, that means 12 times as many as in 1980. Those are the number of people being committed to state prison for drug offenses in the United States in a given year. And what you can see is relative to 1980, by the time you get to 1990, that's up over 10 times as many being committed to prisons. The line here with the open circles, those are the number of drug arrests. So while there were definitely an accelerating number of people being arrested, more than 3 times as many as had been the case in 1990, roughly 12 times as many commitments to state prison, meaning that our sentencing practices were changing so that an arrest was much more likely to lead to a commitment to state prison for a drug offense. By the time we get to the end of the decade, then things flatten out. I'm just saying, during that period of time, our policies changed. Now, there wasn't a central planner who said we're going to change the policies. The federal government's policies changed. But each of the individual state jurisdictions, in their own way, the policies changed was to be more punitive for people who were found in violation of drug statutes.